Can you hear me? Good. Welcome. I'm Robert Cancel in the Literature Department. I've got the honor, the privilege, and the pretty much terrifying experience of trying to introduce the speaker today. And I wanted to do it in a couple of ways. You can Google Ngugi wa Thiong'o and get a lot of the basics, okay? You can find a really nice Wikipedia entry on him. So I'm going to avoid some of the obvious things and take a kind of postmodern page and do a little bit of a pastiche, jumping around here and there. There are a lot of ways that we can look at this. I'm going to focus on three Swahili words to sort of guide what I'm saying. The first one is mzee. Mzee is M-Z-E-E. I'll discuss what it means in a minute. The next one is mstadi. Mstadi, I'll discuss what that means as well. And the third one, mwalimu. Okay, and I hope to relate these terms in some helpful way. I'm going to jump into the introduction to an entry in an encyclopedia that I wrote a while ago, just to sort of get us in medias res. We're going to be kind of not at the beginning, not at the end, but kind of in the middle. Ngugi wa Thiong'o was neither the first nor the last African writer to be imprisoned for by his own government. Yet his period of imprisonment in many ways embodies his growth as a writer and activist, with all the powerful ideas and contradictory associations that characterize his entire career. Jailed partly because of his virulent denunciation of the stifling of Kenyan arts, drama, and language as a result of Western cultural imperialism, Ngugi had the quote for a prison reunion with Voltaire, Balzac, Molière, Zola, Flaubert, Tolstoy, Chekhov, Gorky, Senben Usman, Shakespeare, Bertrand Russell, and Claude McKay, end of quote, in his cell. Ngugi's account of his experience and activities that led to his arrest in Detained, a Writer's Prison Diary, offers a way to understand his worldview as well as learn the details of his incarceration from 31 December 1977 to 12 December 1978. So let me begin with discussing the term mzee. Mzee is kind of a loaded term because when you're a man and you're referred to as mzee, the first thing you know is that you're being called an old man. Okay, I first used the term as a term of address with Professor Ngugi around 2002 when he came here for a conference. But the other side of the mzee, which is kind of a joke in some respects if you're not really that old, is that mzee means someone who's an elder, respected, knows his culture well, and who brings wisdom to those around him. And I think in that way we need to look at the term as it applies here. Briefly, biographically, Ngugi wa Thiong'o was born James Ngugi in 1938 in Limuru in Kenya, which is north of Nairobi. He was born to a family of basically peasant agriculturalists, came of age during the 1950s, where in Kenya we saw the activities 1952 and onwards of the Rebellion of the Land and Freedom Army, often known as Mau Mau. And he lived in the place where this was going on. He had relatives and friends involved in the struggle. I think he might agree it was a formative time. He came to prominence from the early 60s onwards as a kind of wunderkind author. He wrote his first novel and most of his second one while he was still an undergraduate at Makerere University in Uganda. He is, by 1967, he had become the preeminent East African writer in English. At that point, he published his third novel, A Grain of Wheat. at around that time, maybe a bit before. He was doing master's work at the University of Leeds, focusing on Caribbean writing, particularly the writing of, please help me, thank you, George Lamming. I didn't write it in my notes. It's through that particular book of essays called Homecoming that I came back to Professor Ngugi as a scholar. I had read the novels as a sort of nascent African literature student. And what I was moved by, it's interesting because I had just come back from the field working in Zambia, totally full of myself, and feeling very confident that I knew the language, the culture, and everything else about the society that I was working in. And I was asked to review Homecoming. Most of you grad students know that because regular professors don't do these things, grad students are often asked to review things. And although the essays were fabulous in many ways, what struck me was the introduction. And I wanted to just read that because it really had a way of setting me in a different perspective to myself and Africa. In the author's note to the collection, Ngugi warns of the, quote, professional friends and interpreters of the African, end of quote, who extol the virtues of certain areas and groups to the rest of the Western world. Quote, we must never succumb to the poisonous and divisive flattery of our enemies. We must find for ourselves what are the most enduring links between us and all our brothers scattered all over the world. We can then build on these links, build a socialist black power, end of quote. Suddenly made me think that I was just one of those people who was thinking it was a good thing to be a professional friend of the African and to somehow interpret the African for other people. And so it really kind of changed the way I looked at my scholarship and I looked at what was available for us to learn. I want to just mention a couple of the works. So from about 1972, when Homecoming comes out, for the next decade and more, there's an alteration or an alternation between scholarly works and creative writing. And these would in many ways set a different tone than the first three novels. Petals of Blood comes out in 1977. Detained, a writer's diary in 1981. Writers in Politics comes out at around the same time. The first novel in Gikuyu, Shaitani Mutaraba Ini, Devil on the Cross, comes out in 1980. Those works will mark the point at which Ngugi decides to write in his own language rather than aggrandizing the English language. And so that is going to form a number of things that are not new to African literary scholarship or debates, but the fact that such a prominent writer had made that choice becomes very important to what's going on. He will put out in 1986 the book by which most scholars know him by, Decolonizing the Mind. And Decolonizing the Mind is a series of incredibly erudite articles that were based on lectures given in Australia. And he makes an amazingly cogent, convincing case for the fact that Africans should write in their own languages. And I want to get back to that in a bit. But by 1982, before that book comes out, he's going to opt in quotes, for exile over returning home and being arrested by the government, who was not amused by either his writing in his own language or the articles that he was publishing as well. I want to take a side move to the term mwalimu. Mwalimu means a teacher, okay? And if you know anything about Ngugi, you know that he's raised many students. He's been very important in his days as a professor at University of Nairobi and afterwards. Some of them have become prominent scholars. Among them would be people like Michere Mugo, Simon Gikandi, a friend of mine, Gichingiri Digirigi, who actually has just published really one of the only and obviously the best book on Ngugi's theater practice. So I wanted to mention that and just give you an example of what he was saying about colonial education. He says in Writers in Politics, 1981, "Let us not mince words. The truth is that the context of our syllabi, the approach to and presentation of the literature, the persons and the machinery for determining the choice of texts and their interpretation were all integral parts of imperialism in its classical colonial phase. And they are today an integral part of the same imperialism, but now in its neocolonial phase. Cultural imperialism, which during colonialism often affected the population and the country unevenly, depending on the colonial policies and the marauding powers of the degree of resistance in each country and in different parts of the country, becomes the major agency of control during neocolonialism, meaning education." Okay, he will write a lot about education and about how all of these things affect the societies. He will change the way that literature is taught in Kenya and then other African universities when in 1968 he and two colleagues, Chaban Lo Leong and Henry Anyumba, will publish an article that's a series of suggestions that becomes known by others as a manifesto called On the Abolition of the English Department. And in that piece, he will stress the fact that African universities have the duty to teach their own literature in the forefront. That is, begin with things like oral traditions, local writing in African languages, local writing in European languages, work your way out regionally. If you're Kenya, you're looking at East African writing, okay? Then you go out to other parts of Africa. When you're done looking at those writings, you're going to look at the diaspora, or the Caribbean, African American writing. And then somewhere way down the list, you're going to start looking at European literature, okay? And it's not just English literature, but all sorts of other literature. And this is going to initiate the change of not a few departments of English in African universities to departments of literature or departments of language and literature. And this is a very fundamental change. His work as a mwalimu is ongoing. He's going to do a number of things, but again, in decolonizing the mind, he says, "The language of African literature cannot be discussed meaningfully outside the context of social forces, which have made it both an issue demanding our attention and a problem calling for a resolution. The choice of language and the use to which language is put is central to a people's definition of themselves in relation to their natural and social environment, indeed, in relation to the entire universe. Hence, language has always been at the heart of the two contending social forces in the Africa of the 20th century." His role as a teacher and as a scholar and as a writer will be dramatically expanded when he chooses to work with his home community in devising cultural production to help the society. He says, "Early one morning in 1976, a woman from Kamirithu village came to my house and she went straight to the point. Quote, 'We hear you have a lot of education and that you write books. Why don't you and others of your kind give some of that education to the village? We don't want the whole amount, just a little of it and a little of your time.'" End of quote. This would then lead to the famous experiments in theater and in culture that would result in Gikuyu language play being devised at that time, the English title being "I Will Marry When I Want." It's an unusual endeavor in which Ngugi and his colleague Ngugi Miri are going to come together with the people from the village and devise the play, develop the dialogue, all in consultation with the local people, looking at the ideas that they wanted to express. Local people would then choose the cast for the play. They would write the songs for the play. They built the stage. And it becomes an exercise in community building that is very unusual in its time. This is going to lead to what I mentioned in the first citation, which is going to be his imprisonment by the government. Not too long after the play is out, is going to be shut down. He will be arrested. His house will be rifled by the government, looking for books and all kinds of evidence. He will spend almost one whole year in jail over that. The experiments with language continue from that point on. The word mstadi, I wanted to just mention as well. For Swahili, it's the closest word that I could find for artist, okay? But I think it's relevant to see the gloss as it's defined. Mstadi, an experienced, skilled, capable person, an accomplished workman, okay? And it gives you a sense of how art is seen in those cultures, all right? It's not something that's put in a museum. It's not something that's held very high away for only certain kinds of people to enjoy. It's something that is the basis. It's in the society, okay? His scholarship, when he leaves Kenya and first moves to England, then the United States, will take full advantage of his exposure to other scholars and other academic endeavors. And I don't want to spend a lot of time, but part of the result of that will be the book Moving the Center, in which he takes new approaches, new tacks to the ideas that he had worked very polemically in the first Writers in Politics. And at first you get a sense that maybe he's getting soft, okay? He writes about an experience of friends on the East African coast one day after a nice meal, reminiscing about things like Makerere and so forth. He will write about Captain Biggles, who's the English adventurer who's like the Tintin we know from Hergé, okay, and Biggles being the flight lieutenant who does all these wonderful things for the English during the Second World War and so forth. And he makes the point that it's people like Biggles were probably dropping bombs on his friends and on his relatives in the forest in the Kakamega. So then you get to the piece that's about Karen Blixen, author of Out of Africa. And the title is indicative. Her cook, her dog. And just one of the citations. When human beings traverse the landscape depicted in the tourist literature, it is only as a part of their of that animal landscape. If you go into many libraries or bookshops to look for books about Africa, you are more likely to find such titles as Vanishing African, The Authentic African, and so on. In the pictures that illustrate the books, such Africans are nearly always naked, and they are often photographed with animals to show the harmony with which, the harmony with the animal landscape. The hunter for pleasure is really the hunter for profit, but on holiday. He does not want to see or face up to the reality that it is the African worker who creates his profit, hence the literary death wish for the African engaged in the active struggle against nature and against human degradation. But there is a third Africa, and for me, the most dangerous Africa, beloved by both the hunter for profit and the hunter for pleasure. This is the Africa in European fiction. And he goes on. Interestingly enough, he gives the talk at a ceremony in Denmark to honor Karen Blixen. I could go on. I think I'm simply going to go back to the notion of the scholarship and how it evolves at Yale and then NYU. While at Yale, he's going to found the first Gikuyu scholarly journal ever, and it's going to go along with the notion that it's important to build a scholarship in the language itself. It's called Mutiri. He will, in conjunction with the West African scholar Mancha Jawara at NYU, go to West Africa and make a documentary on the pioneer filmmaker Semben Usman. I think the notion of Mzee comes back to me mostly because in a lot of ways he's been around for the growth and evolution of what we would call contemporary Anglophone African writing. He was at college already when Things Fall Apart came out, and his books would be among the earliest that would join the dubious term, the canon of African writing. He would be there when the independence joy was turning to skepticism and then eventually disappointment and bitterness, and he would write about that. He would be in what I consider to be a kind of more of a post-colonial era in which he begins to find new ways to discuss these problems and these ideas. He's going to be including, almost everywhere he goes, he finds scholarship that he finds helpful in one way or another, and he's not afraid to apply it, he's not afraid to change. And maybe that's the most interesting about wisdom. You know, we have a saying in English, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. Okay, well, I think Africans would disagree with that. The Mzee is someone who has knowledge, but someone who's always very willing to learn and to keep growing in his later years. And I want to maybe just end with that and say to you, I'm very happy to introduce writer and scholar, activist Ngugi Thiong'o.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and I'm not sure I deserve all that, but still, it was nice of you to mention some of those things. Yeah. Just a small correction, not just Michelle Mogo, whom you mentioned, actually was not one of my students. Actually, we were fellow students together at Makerere and later colleagues at the University of Nairobi. And also we wrote together a play called The Traveler and Kimathi. And Michelle Mogo is now, an outstanding professor at Syracuse University. Otherwise, in terms of meeting many students who I've interacted with over the years, I do get quite a number of surprises from different parts of the world wherever I go. Say, oh, you remember, when we did this particular book with you? Sometimes you don't quite remember, but you're grateful that some other people do remember. Probably the best part you mentioned is the last, when you said about teaching old dog new tricks. Because I'm always trying to learn new tricks, and I must, before I give my talk, actually express my appreciation of the students who met me this morning. Because we had a very interesting dialogue. I learned a lot from them, about Dominican literature, Caribbean literature, about early modern literature, Shakespeare, and the others who wrote, Johnson and others who wrote around that time. So it's, I was very, very impressed with how they looked at literature and its interactions with power. And I was asking one of them, Diego, whether he was typical of San Diego University. I was very, very impressed. I was very impressed with that interaction. And talking of learning, I mean, just one thing, when I came here and I was told that I was shown the library here, the one when you're walking, there's a library. And I was told it's shaped like a snake, And I looked, maybe. Then I was told, of course, a snake, the biblical image of the Garden of Eden, the story of Adam and Eve and the tree of knowledge. Now, what I find interesting about that, and I was thinking about that in my talk actually, about that was that first of all, it's one of the earliest instances of censorship, because remember, Adam and Eve are told you can, get to know everything else here, but eat all the other fruit. But that tree over there, who is the tree of knowledge, no. Okay. And it's very interesting that it's Eve, the woman who becomes, she's the first rebel, we know. Because, she's the one who sort of asserts the right to resistance, the right to know, in fact. So the heart of that story is also the question, of knowledge, and how that knowledge, of course, brings about power. The power to distinguish between moral alternatives and so on, But at the same time, there are also consequences of that knowledge. For it brings about first, kind of internal, call it internal confinement before they're expelled from paradise. In other words, the notion of prison and exile, are contained also in that story. So the story has so many other, implications and so on. I was thinking about that, before I came to give a talk this evening. Because I was thinking, well, knowledge empowers, but it's also, but so many intellectuals, so many seekers of knowledge have had to pay a price for that, either knowledge or for breaking barriers, for asking questions that had never been asked before, or daring to climb mountains that have never been climbed before, daring, and they have to pay the price for, and they rage from, religious, thinkers, philosophers, Of course, the most famous is Socrates, who had to pay a price for asking, questions or being what called a gadfly, awkward questions, questions of truth and justice, But if you look at any intellectual history of any community, Western intellectual history or intellectual history of ideas and so on, that history is replete with intellectual seekers of knowledge who have had to face, either prison, exile, or death. Any history, whether English history, French history, Russian history, or say European history, as a whole. And when we were having discussions with one of the students who came from me, John, he mentioned the fact that Johnson, even Ben Jonson in the era of Elizabethan times, was actually was put in prison at one stage because of one of his plays and so on. So that has always been, part of the whole process of seeking knowledge, empowerment, freedom, yes, but also certain consequences is part of the occupational hazards of seeking knowledge, exile, death, or exile, imprisonment, death, or exile, and part of that interesting history of seekers of knowledge is those who work in the realm of imagination, And sometimes one may wonder, yes, it's okay for Eve to get into problems because of a tree of knowledge, at least this tree of knowledge is there, But what about those, say, prophets, whose only crime is that they have said what could happen, what could happen if you do ABC, this can happen. In other words, they are saying they can imagine what might happen, and they pay a price, for that, What about the writers, poets who think they're only telling a story, to amuse, those who listen to the story, and then they find themselves into trouble because of that. What is the relevance of products of imagination, to life? And this is what I want to examine, briefly, with also some extracts from my book, Wizard of the Crow, to show how how maybe an artist approaches, reality. But let me start by saying that this is where the mic is. I just read the first part and then sort of read from the Wizard of the Crow to illustrate. But remember, the fundamental issue is one of imagination, the products of imagination, and their relevance to life. In my life and career, as you are told, I've worn many hats, 2 or 3 principally, that of an academic, ideas and all that, and that of a writer of fiction and drama. As a literary critic and public intellectual, I've always asked, like many others have, is the relevance of literature to life. I've taken a position in my books, some were cited here in the introduction, following the old debate so important and earnest in the 50s of last century, and best summed up in Sartre's book about the commitment in literature to life, that literature had something to say about life, politics in particular. And in my books of essays, Writers in Politics, for instance, I argued that the two were intertwined, for I argue that literature does not arise in a vacuum, and dramatically introducing the essays with the statement that every writer was a writer in politics, and the only question was which politics. But there was a problem, and the problem is still there. If one reads a work of fiction which had the most insightful of extended political analysis, even the most fervent of readers would keep it aside. For such a reader realized that if they wanted to insight from political analysis or economic theory, they might as well, read a treatise on politics and economics directly. So you don't obviously go to a novel to read about economic theory and or political theory for that matter. The same with history or environment. So there is an assumption, for instance, literature as a work of imagination had to be literature. For instance, fiction had to be fiction. And if it tried to be politics, then people are dissatisfied with it. And yet the question of its relevance to life remained. For arguments to go on, what's the relevance of literature to life, what's the relevance of art to life and all that. So for me, it is clear that fiction or products of what Tim Rice calls fictive imagination occupy a realm distinctively different from other mental realms. But what was that realm, with its own particularity, assumed at the same time to be relevant to life? Now I wanted to keep that question in mind, and I'll come back to it towards the end of these comments, because I want to argue later how fundamental art is to life in general, so important that we take it for granted, but very, very, in some ways, very, very fundamental, and I'll show why. Now, at the same time, I want to illustrate through a reading from Wizard of the Crow, how, a fiction writer, as a fiction writer, or how fiction might approach reality, as opposed to, say, when I write essays like Decolonizing the Mind, or writers in politics, how do I approach reality that is part of us? Obviously, when I came to write Wizard of the Crow, for instance, I was very much interested in issues of how I was seeing the world in terms of globalization. I was particularly disturbed by two tendencies which I think are still going on in the world. What is the world dominated by a group of very wealthy nations in the West, a group, and many nations, poor nations in Africa and Asia, for instance. And yet, the wealth of the few nations in the West is dependent on the resources of Africa and Asia. Of course, it's been disturbing is that the gap between the wealth of the few and the poverty of the many has been deepening and widening. So that's one rift which has really interested me a great deal. But I'm also interested in another tendency which is in the world, which is that within each and every nation, the most developed or the least developed, there's another rift which has been emerging, which is very evident if you go to Los Angeles or New York or London or Nairobi, Johannesburg, Bombay, or wherever you go. There's a gap between the wealthy few in each society, and the majority of poor. That gap is once again widening, not closing. Because you'd think that if a country or a nation is very, very developed, you'd think that gap would close, for instance, But the reality is, you go to Los Angeles, for instance, not about San Diego, but you go to Los Angeles, you find beggars and homeless, for instance, New York, the same. You go to London and you find the beggar and homeless, You go to Johannesburg, the same. Nairobi, the same. It's like that is being, becoming part of what it is modern now. And yet, within, and one aspect of the beggar, in addition to the beggar and the homeless, is the question of prison population in many countries in the world. Is a demographic which is really increasing in many countries. In some countries, say when you have about 2 million people in prison, for instance, and they are not visible. It's and when you realize that a number of nations who are members of the United Nations are even less than 2 million, some of them, then what we are really saying is that there are some nations which are buried, within many nations in the world, and there's a trend also, of modern, world. So I was very much interested in some of those issues, but how was I going to approach them? First, I want to read to you a section that describes the vision of the new world under globalization. In this section, I had to find an image that describes for me what I was going to describe to you now in terms of, the two gaps of wealth and poverty between and among nations. My novel, Wizard of the Crow, has as dominant character a dictator in a third world country called Australia, who wants to do incredible things like building the tallest building in the world, in the history of humankind, a building that will take him to heaven, so that he is in the same residential neighborhood with God. So that in the morning he can say, "Hi, God," or "How, neighbor," and things like that. But how is he going to meet the cost of this building that will take him to heaven? What he calls marching to heaven. He'll get a loan from the Global Bank and the Global Ministry of Finance, so that, but who will pay for the loans? Of course, the people of the citizens of Australia, the present generation, and many, many other generations to come. They have also a vision of the world. I'll come back to that a little bit. There was a vision of the world which I want to read to you, because I was trying to find an image which can describe this world. He has, one of his ministers of finance has come to Washington, or where he has met with the military leaders and thinkers and members of the Global Bank and all that. Okay, the directors, New York. And when he comes back, he's advising the ruler, as the dictator is called, and his advice he gives him. The Global Bank and the Global Ministry of Finance are clearly looking to privatize countries, nations, and states. They argue that the modern world was created by private capital. The subcontinent of India, for instance, was owned by the British East India Company, Indonesia by the Dutch East India Company, and our neighbors by the British East African Company, and the Congo Free State by a one-man corporation. Corporate capital was aided by missionary societies. What private capital did then, it can do so again. Own and reshape the third world in the image of the West without the slightest blot, blemish, or blotch. NGOs, or non-government organizations, will do what the missionary charities did in the past. The world will no longer be composed of the outmoded 20th century division of East, West, and a directionless third. The world will become one corporate globe divided into the incorporating and the incorporated. The advice which he gives him is that we should volunteer Australia to be the first to be wholly managed by private capital, to become the first voluntary corporate colony, what he calls copolony, the first in the new global order. With the privatization of Australia and with the NGOs relieving us of social services. The country becomes your real estate. You'll be collecting land rent in addition to the commission fee for managing the co-colonial army and co-colonial police force. And the co-colonial powers will reward you as a modern visionary. The system I was going to describe is what I gave the name in the novel, co-colonialism. So that's a new word for you. Now, let me come back to this particular marching to heaven to see how I approach that particular, question without necessarily, having a political analysis of the ills of globalization. As I told you, the dictator, who is simply called the ruler, wants to build a building which will take him to heaven. He can be going to heaven and back whenever he wants, but he really wants to stay in the same residential neighborhood with God. Now, of course, his ministers, because the dictatorship is surrounded by sycophants, they are very excited about this vision, and they compete with each other to see who can become more sycophantic than the other, Yeah. And one of them, for instance, is an honorary member of parliament called Marcus, who goes to England and he checks himself into a major London hospital to get his eyes surgically enlarged, and he held a press conference. He's doing this because he wants to see after his surgical enlargement of his eyes, which become bigger than the electric bulbs and so on, he puts a press conference to say that he's doing this so that he can be able to see the eyes, the enemies of the ruler, the dictator, whatever they are. The ruler is so touched by this expression of devotion that even before he comes back, he's made Minister of Foreign Affairs, so he can be looking at the ruler's interest in the world. And in fact, he changes his name from whatever his name was, and it becomes, in Kiswahili, Machokali, meaning ferocious eyes. So his full name becomes Marcus Machokali. Now, there's another member of parliament who sees that there's an easy way to power. And what does he do? He checks himself to a major hospital in Paris. He thinks the French, the English have all been rivals and so on, and he's, so he goes to Paris, where he has his ears enlarged and a little bit mobile. They become larger than those of a rabbit. And the idea is he can hear whatever the enemies of the state are plotting against the state or against the ruler. And even before he comes back, he's given the ministry of spying on the population. And his name becomes Kyoku, big ears. Now, we're told that other members of parliament would have followed suit and had their bodies altered depending on what services they wanted to render the ruler, except for what happened to Benjamin Mambo. As a young man, Mambo had failed to get into the army because he was small in size. But the fire for a military life never died. And now, with the new avenues of power opened by Machokali, ferocious eyes, and Sikioku, ferocious ears, he thought of the best bodily change to land him the defense minister portfolio. And for many days he agonized about this. In the end, he chose to have his tongue elongated, so that in echoing the ruler's command, his words would reach every soldier in the country, and his threats to his enemies before they could reach the Afrarian border. He first emulated Sikyoku or ferocious ears and went to Paris. But there were some language difficulties or some misunderstanding about the required size. And the tongue, like a dog's, now hung out way beyond his lips, rendering speech impossible. Machokali came to his aid by arranging for him to go to a clinic in Berlin for corrective surgery, where the lips were now pulled and elongated to cover the tongue. But even then, not completely, and the tongue protruded now just a little. And then, oh, lo and behold, the ruler misread the signified and gave him the ministry of information. And the ruler thought he just wanted to talk, so well. This was not bad, and Mambo marked his elevation to a cabinet post by changing his forenames and called himself Big Ben. This inspired by the clock at the British Houses of Parliament, so that his full name was now Big Ben Mambo. And just as part of this, one of the ways, of course, we talk about in fiction, but also of course, in real life, is is resistance to authoritarianism. And once again, one can write a treatise on how to organize political parties, how they should be structured, how, but I chose in the novel a different, track, Now, I realized dictatorships like to equate themselves with God. For instance, in Zaire, I understand that whenever Mobutu was shown on television, he was shown descending from heaven. Okay? So, one of the ways people do in this kind of situation, in resistance, is to deconstruct the dictatorship through jokes and telling stories that make people laugh about, the dictator and the ruler and the authoritarian regime. And I try to utilize that in the novel here, and I'll show you how. I also try to utilize the misunderstandings that can often come through people where you've got many languages, like in Kenya, or, even if you know more than one African language, it doesn't mean that you understand every nuance of that language and so on. So I want to show you how I utilize some of those, to actually take my little bit on, on dictatorship. Now, we come to Minister Machokali. Minister Machokali was waxing ecstatic about the benefits of the project, how they will trickle down to all the citizens, trickle down economics. You see, once the project was completed, no historian would ever again talk about any other wonders in the world, for the fame of this modern house of Babel would dwarf the hanging gardens of Babylon, the Egyptian pyramids, or the Great Wall of China. And who, my friends, would ever talk of the Taj Mahal? Our project of marching to heaven will be the first and only super wonder in the history of the world. In short, Machokali declared, marching to heaven was a special birthday cake the citizens had decided to bake for their one and only leader, the eternal ruler of the Free Republic of Australia. Here, Machokali paused dramatically to allow for a little ovation. Well, except for a few members of parliament and policemen and soldiers, nobody clapped. But Machokali says, oh, well, I understand you are so overwhelmed with joy that you are lost for words. I understand. But is there not one of you who can express their joy in words? A man raised his hand, and Machokali quickly, a mzee raised his hand, and Machokali quickly beckoned him to come over to the microphone. The man, clearly advanced in years, leaned on a walking stick as he pushed through the crowd. 2 police officers ran to him and helped him to the microphone near the platform. Age, as you are told, was still revered in Australia, and the multitude waited for his words as if from an oracle. But when the old man began to speak, it was clear that he had difficulty in pronouncing Swahili words for the ruler, which are Mtukufu Raisi, calling out instead Mtukutu Rahisi. Horrified at the ruler's being called a cheap excellency, one of the policemen quickly whispered in the old man's ear that the phrase was Mtukufu Raisi, or Raisi Mtukufu, which confused him even more. Coughing and clearing his throat to still himself, he called out into the microphone, Rahisi Mkundu. Oh no, it is not a cheap asshole, the other policeman whispered in the other ear. No, it is His Holy Mightiness. Listen, Mutukufu, Mutakatifu. Which did not help matters, because the old man now said with what he thought was real confidence, Mukundu Takatifu. At the mention of his holy asshole, the multitude broke out in hilarious laughter, which made the old man now forget what he had wanted to say, and he stuck religiously to the phrase Rahis Mukundu, which made the Machokali quickly signal that he be removed from the microphone. The old man did not understand why he was not being allowed to speak, and as he was led back into the crowd, he let out a stream of Rahisi Mukundu, Mutukutu Takatifu Mukundu, Mukutukutu, any combination of cheap and holy assholes he thought might work, gesturing toward the ruler as if begging for his divine intervention. Now, one more scene which is set in New York. Because what happens is this. At one time, the ruler with his entourage, he's so impressed by his vision of marching to heaven that he thinks the whole world should know. So how does he address the whole world? Comes to New York, United Nations General Assembly, when all the leaders are gathered, At the same time, he also took time to meet with the directors of the Global Bank to work out some things about the loan. Unfortunately, when he stays in, let me first see, how many have you been to, Manhattan, New York? Oh yes, so you know Fifth Avenue. which ends or starts at Washington Square. Now, this is something I wonder there are very few historians who know about this, but I'll tell you. At Fifth Avenue, at the beginning, there was actually a hotel, which is the oldest hotel in the world. It's older than the United States of America itself, but not many people know about that. It's no longer there exactly, but I know where the ruins are. But that, after the class, after the lecture, I can whisper the secret to you, okay? Now, this hotel was actually there, and this is where the ruler stayed. But he finds himself the subject of a very mysterious disease that expands the body mysteriously, but proportionately, you know. So it's becoming bigger. And the ministers don't know what to do about this. They try and cover him with clothes, but the clothes become tatters in seconds. They try everything, you know. In the end, they just cover him with sheets, you know, and becomes literally a mound of, how do I say this word? A mound of shit, not the other one, you know. Now, but at the same time, they look for doctors. And you know, the New York University is very famous in medical school and so on, you know, and they look for doctors there who specialize in, say, bodily kind of, well, obesity, put it that way. The one they get is called Dr. Clark, and when he comes there, he takes temperature, normal, stool, normal. Everything about this man is normal except the expansion, the endless expansion. So what he does, Clarkwell, he dials his old professors, you know, at Harvard, medical, whatever, and his name is Furyk, who comes to New York and takes temperature, normal. Everything is normal. But he's puzzled by the illness. Now, when the ministers see and realize that these Western doctors cannot cure, they think, well, let's import a witch doctor from Africa. So they import a witch doctor from Africa. But they have a problem because they are modern. They don't want the witch doctor to meet or to cross paths with Dr. Furyk or Professor Furyk and his assistant, the Clarkwell. But when the Wizard of the Crow comes, he says he wants to meet everybody, anybody who has been in touch with the expanding body of the ruler. And Machokali has difficulties in knowing exactly how he's going to tell Furyk that he's being summoned by what? A doctor? Asked an astounded Furyk after Machokali had summoned him. Machokali allowed that the man who was some kind of specialist, no, not quite, spiritualist, yes, he's a spiritualist. But only after many probing questions did he admit that he was talking about a witch doctor. What? A sorcerer in New York? An astounded Furyk asked. And here, by the way, this is very special because this is my first time to give a talk in this particular university, although I've been here before, you know. And I want to share something else with you, please. Only that, please don't tell anybody who was not here, okay? It's a secret between you two. I want to share with you. What happened was this, that Dr. Furyk kept a diary of this mysterious illness. And so he has all the details of what happened. Now, I believe, or I came across a copy of the diary because for 10 years I was working as a professor of performance studies at New York University. I came across a copy of that diary. Okay? Now, please don't tell anybody. It's a very precious document. But I'll do something special. I'm going to quote directly from the diary, okay? I take that from your silence that there's a promise that you don't tell anybody, okay? So let me quote from him. I looked at Macho Kali to reassure myself of my sanity, he wrote in his diary. And I found his big eyes begging me not to reject the sermons. So instead of giving a resounding no, as I had intended, I found myself telling him not to worry. He is a doctor of the mind and I of the body, so between us we should be a dream team. I was simply trying to calm him down, even as I grew curious. I looked forward to meeting the man who seemed to have a hold on these Western-educated, high-ranking government ministers. But as I was about to enter the man's room, I wondered how we would communicate with hand gestures. Imagine my surprise when I encountered a witch doctor who spoke English as if he had been educated at Harvard. I said to him, "You speak excellent English. Where did you learn the language so well?" He said, "At the University of Treetops." Well, I never heard of that university or seen it cited anywhere. And then he asked me, "What about you? You also speak excellent English. Where did you go to school?" I was a little irritated by both the question and the tone. For could he not see that I was white? What else did he expect me to speak? "Harvard, of course," I said curtly. And then I asked him, "So, in your country, they teach sorcery and witchcraft at the university level?" He replied, "Oh, yes. The art and science of witchcraft are the core of the university system of Treetops. We have both teaching and research departments that specialize in magic. What about you? Don't you?" "Of course not," I said. "Here we have departments of medicine and psychiatry and pharmacology." And I quickly changed the subject and told him how glad I was to meet him to discuss the strange illness that had befallen their leader, a strange malignity, this self-induced expansion, rare, never ever heard of it before. Yes, that was it. And I suddenly realized that I had given a name to the oddity, SIE, self-induced expansion. There's a little argument about intellectual property and all that, but I'll not go into that. There is one more section which I want to read, but before I come to that, about environment. But that's really using, as you can see throughout, I'm trying to use images to really discuss, serious matters of globalization, of loans, of begging, and all that, you know. But why doing similar things have I been in trouble with government? Why should a story like this make anybody really? It's fantasy. One of the characters here travels as in the form of a bird. So it's quite clear. It's not pretending to be a political analysis. And yet it will get me into problems. Or similar things have gotten me into problems. And not just me, all writers who are all products of the imagination. And I want to talk a little bit, really about the role of imagination in society, and then I'll end. We can have questions. Now, is imagination something that is relevant to real life, or is something which real life can do without? Surely art is not like other human activities which are assumed to be more useful to life. They have use values. For instance, we all know that food and water are useful because without them we cannot live. The body needs food to eat and water to drink and air to breathe in order to live. Activities that generate such use values are themselves accorded value. And yet, while we eat to live, we clearly do not live to eat. There is an ethical dimension to human existence, a spirituality, whose needs are met by various moral systems, often given the name of religions. So religion is to the soul and spirituality what food and water are to the body. And by religion here I'm talking about moral systems, whatever form. The feeling of being part of, connected to a thing bigger than oneself, is a driving force in human strivings. And affluent societies, from ancient Egypt to the present, have always been ready to put aside portions of the general wealth to maintain, for instance, a priestly, class. But the materiality and spirituality are not only the only realms pertinent to our existence. There is a third realm, the realm of imagination, without which the other two, our material welfare and our spiritual welfare, may not be possible. Imagination is a builder of nature. Without nature, there's nurture. And nurture is impossible without the role of imagination. For instance, an architect imagines the shape and size of a building, its spatial relations, and then draws it on paper before it is taken by builders and erected as a material reality, which we call a building, like the library I was talking about. The same applies to roads, engines, everything that has been created by human. These are imagined before they are realized as material objects. Even non-material activities like journeys would be impossible, for we first imagine where we are going and then follow it with our feet or wheels. Not just the realization of the material. Even the performance of the spiritual realm would be impossible without imagination. We must have the capacity to imagine God, for instance, or imagine the soul, and the relationship that the two entail. Such symbolic rites like baptism, sacraments, or telling beads in Catholic, Buddhist, or Islamic worship would have no meaning without the imagination that links the material to the non-material experience. In short, imagination makes our experience of material and spiritual experience possible. In other words, imagination is itself a material activity, for it has direct effect on material in the realm of nature. In other words, the human created universe would not be possible without imagination. Now comes the question: if food and water and air nourish the body, religious rites or moral system nourish the ethical and the spiritual, what nourishes that which makes all the other elements of the human created universe possible? It is surely art, by way of music, painting, sculpture, drawings, performance, the activities without apparently direct and immediate use values. This may explain why there has never been any non-human community without artistic activities of one kind or other. Even cave dwellers used to make cave drawings in addition to stories, songs, and dances. If imagination is so central to our material and spiritual experience, then that which nourishes it is not peripheral to the human, but also central to it. Therefore, just as the body needs quality food as opposed to junk food or imbalanced food, and the spiritual needs quality religious or other moral performances for a healthy body and a healthy mind, so does imagination. A body without good food shrivels, so also a soul without sound moral teachings, but so also the imagination. So art, for me, and literature is part of that art, nourishes the imagination. And imagination plays a central role in everything we do, even in mathematical, scientific, and technical discoveries. Remember, for instance, the moment when the quantity of data changes into or makes a qualitative leap into the new, that moment of sudden illumination, the one that made the famous science cry out, Eureka, this is a leap of imagination. That's what we call the reality of imagination, or shall I say the reality that imagination builds from the arts to the sciences. Imagination, in other words, is a universal web that connects things seen and those not yet seen. It connects the different senses, the different senses of perception and what they logically project across time and space. It is what makes time travel possible. It is time. It's a time machine of popular science fiction, and therefore what feeds it is material to our existence. Imagination makes the world. The arts nourish. The arts that nourish that imagination is, in my view, the celebrated food, of the gods. That's what we can see. This tremendous struggle there has always been between social classes, or between nations, or between systems of control and liberation, the struggle of shaping the images or art that feed the imagination. In most cases, particularly authoritarian regimes, they want us to create images that create the notion, a la Candida's Voltaire, that we have arrived at the best of all possible worlds. this is the best of all possible worlds, But imagination, remember, always raises the possible. There's something possible, that the other worlds are possible. And so that other worlds are possible means, in a way, implicitly challenging this notion that we have arrived at the best of all, worlds. So, if you ask me about the relevance of literature or art to life, it is not a matter of being relevant. It is actually essential to life, to operational power in society, to politics, to economic life, to our very existence. Thank you. Yeah, you can ask a question there.
You need a minute?
Huh?
You okay?
Yeah, fine. Yeah.
Questions, concerns, comments?
You said your first pieces were in English. Why did it take you so long to start writing in your language?
Let me repeat the question. Did everyone hear? The first literary works are in English. Why did it take so long to begin writing in your own language?
It's still a challenge writing African languages, or for that matter. If you look at the world, in terms of the linguistic shape of the world, European languages dominate all the other languages in the world, particularly languages from Africa and Asia, particularly from those societies which have been colonized. Okay? Now, remember that when one starts to write, one does not have very big ideological imperatives. You start to write because of the book you've just read. You found it very exciting, and it excites your imagination or whatever, or the story you've just heard. And many of the education systems in Africa, particularly when I was growing up, were all in English. In fact, it's worse today than it was actually when I was growing up during the colonial times. In African languages have been completely marginalized, So when you start to write, it was almost axiomatic, almost assumed that you write in English, even when the majority of the people of the community you come from do not speak the language. Okay? Yeah. So, for instance, I went to schools in Kenya and then university, college in a neighboring territory, Makerere University. And I started writing really as an undergraduate, and I was a student of English literature, the books I read, Dickens and all that, all in English and so on. So you started writing in English, and everybody was writing in English anyway, So for me, stopping to write in English was a conscious, deliberate choice arising from what I had thought about language and the relationship between languages in terms of power, or arising from what I had thought about the role of language in systems of domination and liberation. In other words, it was a conscious choice, although actually how I came to actually take that decision is another story, it's a rather long story, yeah.
Questions? Yes.
I very much enjoyed the Wizard of the Crow. I thought it was really wonderful, and I was very curious about the ways that the African oral tradition affected the way that you told the story. Because when I was reading it, it felt very much as if I was being told a story. That also made it very difficult to put down. But I was curious, and I was curious how African oral tradition helped construction,
Yeah, when I started writing, what is interesting about languages is that different languages, first of all, of course, different languages have their own musicality, they have their own way of looking at the world. Of course, all languages look at the same world. It doesn't mean that one language creates a different world, But I'm just saying, if you think of language as a window, to the world and so on, different languages are like different windows, to the world, so to speak, For instance, even arrangement of words, in terms of, say, relation between noun and adjective, may change in different, languages. For example, the English will talk about, say, the tall man, the blue, whatever. In Kikuyu language, for example, we don't say that. We are more like to say the sky, which is blue. The adjective will probably come after the noun, and so on. Now, one of these which, in writing in Kikuyu, liberated me even more. First of all African literature, even literature in English, borrows very heavily from the oral tradition. You can see this in the works of Chinua Achebe or other writers, they are very much indebted to orature, what we call orature, or oral, traditions. But with me, when I came to write in Kikuyu language, I felt even more liberated to borrow from that tradition and even try to go beyond that, try to structure my narratives as if they were themselves oral narratives. It's a kind of experimentation in one way, but it's also very exciting. I don't think I would have been able to do quite that, had I not started writing, in Kikuyu. So that orality comes across when you are reading the English translation. I feel very happy. Yeah.
The translator was the author, in case people don't know.
Yes.
Questions, concerns? Yes.
I was kind of wondering, I was reading about a couple of peasant movements in India in which peasants want to learn English at an earlier stage in their educational careers. So I think that the movement was to start teaching English starting with 4th grade instead of 7th grade, because the idea was that English would give you greater access to the economy. And so what I'm curious to know is how you reconcile perhaps these perceived economic benefits to learning English, to improving your material conditions with writing in Kikuyu and writing to Kenyans in Kikuyu.
There's no more or less economic benefits of any language. I mean, we think of language in terms of knowledge. Any language is really a vehicle of knowledge and so many things. So in that sense, the size of language or the size of the community that speak any given language does not matter. It's like, think of language as primary computer, is the primary natural computers, And so when you deny or suppress any one language, it's like finding a child with a computer or, and crashing that one, say, I'll give you another one or a different one or whatever, which does not function the same way. But the hard disk in that computer which you crashed, is gone, more or less, So language is a vehicle of knowledge and many other things, So you don't, when you build empowerment in any person, you build on what they already have, okay? You don't take away what they have and then start them all over again, okay? Every language has its systems of knowledge, of environment, of whatever, of medicines, of philosophical sayings and so on. And you can see this clearly when you look at some of those texts in history, in the intellectual development, which have made an impact in the world all over. For instance, the Bible, You think of Jesus, for instance, you think of his disciples and so on, They spoke Aramaic, and probably many people who read the Bible today don't even know that the original language was either Aramaic, spoken by the actors in the Bible was Aramaic, and probably they don't even know Aramaic themselves, okay? We often read in translation and so on. But so think of the richness of the Bible, given rise to by this, language. Think of, Quran. Think of the Book of Life by Buddha, and think of all those Chinese, that knowledges, that we think of the small. So Greek was a small language, but think of all the inheritance we have gained, from that, language and so on, So any language contains knowledge. You add on to that knowledge, not take away that knowledge first and then try to. So in that sense, every language, to the extent that knowledge is important in our interaction with the environment, economically, politically, whatever, every language is important. And the key thing is to add to the languages, not to take away. In other words, if I know Kikuyu language very well and add English to it, or French, or Russian, or Chinese, or Hindi, that's empowerment. But in fact, when you take away other languages and so leave only one, you actually, or other language, but you don't know if the language of the own community, whom presumably you're going to serve and so on, that's actually enslavement, And I think the whole world is in danger of entering this, the prison of monolingualism, This is a danger I see in the world today, that gradually, look at some of these. When I was coming here, I asked my friends Diego, and I was asking about these eucalyptus plants, where they come from, But I'd like you to go, when you go out, just look at any one of the eucalyptus tree, and you see underneath it there are no other plants, Eucalyptus tends to suck water, from, and so it shrivels all the other growths around it and so on. You don't find, like I found when I went to Hawaii, island, sort of the type of growth where you find in one small area so much, different types of plants, different types of ants, they are all part of that ecological system there, The eucalyptus sucks. So monolingualism is like a eucalyptus tree, anywhere. It crushes, sort of, then let's say that I am the only tree, but it actually crushed growth and what would have fertilized even more. Yeah, monolingualism to me, whatever it is a language prison. And it's actually an enemy to knowledge and therefore human empowerment, not the other way around.
Your answer to Idara's question involved a model that was additive and inclusive of different languages. But at the end of your talk, the way you described the role of art, and that of course art, like your own art, which is language, implied, or even was more perhaps explicit about the role in a situation that involves conflict, because you said something about art being and imagination being the means by through which certain conflicts, you referred to class at the beginning of your talk, and of course there's a work in the subtext that talk today has to do with colonialism and neocolonialism. So I guess my question is, there seems to be a different kind of aesthetic that you are arguing for
necessarily just inclusive and additive, but also involves conflict.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure what I follow, but let me say, of course, with the language situation within, say, if you thought about harmonians, I mean, a group that speaks only one language, say, of course, even within that community, to the extent that there are social classes in that group, this will also be reflected in how language, for instance, is used in a community. There are, when I was in England some years ago, when I grew up in Kenya, we had been taught to speak a certain kind of English, which was actually very colonial English, because the colonial presence in Kenya was of a particular type of English person. And so when some of us went to the University of Leeds and we find people there speaking regional type of English, we thought they were speaking bad English. We thought they did not know English language. We thought we know. In other words, thought we had owned the language. But anyway, what I'm saying that even in question one, of course, one community, so except there are social classes in that group and so on, there will be, or this will be reflected also in language. But language in terms of is being a vehicle of knowledge, even though there might be, it also can be a source of conflict and so on, still doesn't take away from that, fact that, language is a vehicle of knowledge. It's the means by which, quite frankly, we're able to interact with one another and create that, or other language is also the means through which, if you like, imagination is also expressed. So the two things are not necessarily mutually exclusive. Oh, of course, sorry, of course we're talking about politics, we're talking about, when we're talking about material in terms of human, of course we bring all those factors, or when I talk about nature, all those factors come in. The question of power relationship between, peoples, for instance, the question of governance, in a way, because in every material activity, power relationship do also develop. Okay? And after all, let me put it this way. Let me tell you my shortest definition of politics. I hope there are no political science around here. For me, politics, shortest definition of politics is the organization of power in society. Simply, then we can ask a number of questions, who holds that power, what are the ends towards which, power is put and so on, on whose behalf is that power being exercised, within a social group, whether for this class or that class, or in, say, in a situation where one group of people are dominated by others, whether that power is being exercised on behalf of the dominating or the, or whatever, but that exercise of power, in society. When I group the material, food for the body, moral systems for the soul, I was not taking the three large realms, But of course, in reality, all those three realms, also create or develop or make possible other activities, including how we organize society, But even then, they are connected also. When power says, try to restrict imagination, or like we see today, the struggle over images, because they want to shape how we look at society in a certain way. So we can say that even at the level of images, there is a lot of struggle going on. It's not just one thing. There's a very fierce, ferocious struggle, over images, in the world today. For instance, in the realm of film, the kind of films that have been shown, the kind of reality shows we see on television. All that production of those images here and production of images in other parts of the world and so on, there's a very fierce, struggle. But essentially, when I was talking about imagination, when the state says, or try to shrivel the imagination of a community, it's because, I said, they don't want, because imagination always tries to see different possibilities. They not even be logical possibilities, but the whole point of imagination is, for instance, look, if I mention the word home, just the word home, listen, within seconds, just seconds, we have all gone to our own homes, or even various homes we have been to, or even whether that home has been pain or love or whatever, all within seconds, and back. Okay? We can imagine. So, future, we can travel in time. Imagination is a time machine, We can go back, in the past. We can traverse space. We can do this, what the land has been doing in Mars right now, that had been anticipated long before in science fiction. People had traveled there, and back anyway. But in terms of political struggle or power struggle, there's an attempt to sometimes restrict the flight of imagination or make imagination only come up with certain images. An attempt, because in reality, obviously, it's not always possible to restrict the imagination. Yes?
My question follows what you said a little while ago, about home and traveling and coming back and so on. And I was wondering if you could speak about now living in Southern California and what that does to the kind of theorizing that you do about the imagination, about images, distance, and the notion of place, which is very important to your writing, and how has that changed with the Southern Californian location, which a lot of people might say is a very unreal place.
So first of all, I did not know that I was when I came here 5 years ago from NYU or from the East Coast, and then before that London, before that Kenya, and so on, and I did not know that I was a South Californian until last year when Wizard of the Crow won the California Gold Medal for fiction. And I think Los Angeles Times talked about, the South Californians who had won the prize. Say, wait a minute, I'm a South Californian. And it felt quite good, actually. But in terms of my own intellectual enterprise or projects, imaginative or purely intellectual or academic, I'm very interested in the one word, connect, that Ian Foster talked about, if only connect, because I'm interested in the phenomena is connected. It's linkages between phenomena that I'm really interested in so many ways. Even when I think of disciplines, say economics or politics or art and so on, I of course accept that each, say, discipline has its own kind of autonomy, its own particularity, its form that makes it, say, history as opposed to political science or as opposed to literature and so on, but at the same time there are, of course, the other side of that they are also connected. So is that connection between phenomena that I'm interested in? So if I'm in Southern California, as I am, I say, in what way is Southern California connected to Kenya, where I come from? What is it that I can learn here that illuminates my knowledge of Kenya, and the other way around? How is my knowledge of Kenya able to illuminate my, how I look at, Southern California, Irvine, or Los Angeles, and so on, and this is what I do when I go to places. I try to see again, just see. I'm very fascinated by these connections, between places. Not in terms of the fact that this one is exactly like another place, but in terms of how does my experience here illuminate positively or otherwise, my other experience, elsewhere.
Yes.
Yes, I was wondering if you had a favorite example that you can think of that best demonstrates that connection between art and imagination and the connection it has to other endeavors.
I thought I gave quite a few, but let me try to think of one. Okay. I'm going to read that section which I was going to read, okay? And the reason I'm going to read this particular section actually is because in some ways it's about, it's another secret which I want to tell you, but I have so many secrets, I don't know what I'm going to do about it, but this one is very difficult to tell because this particular section which I'm going to read, and which I hope will be in some ways a response that indirectly is actually about you. You inspired me. And I was writing about, well, let me track a little bit. So I wanted to help me to check by going back to that particular what inspired me. So I wanted to remember that incident, I think, or a moment really, or rather call it a moment rather than an incident, say, you have been with this particular friend for many years, or you are coming from, you have just met, or you're coming from a cinema, or you're in the living room, or listen to music, or walk in the yard, and so on. And I think you remember that moment when maybe you looked at each other and then you felt something has changed. But his voice or her voice or somehow different. Not only the voice, the environment is changed. And it's the same person. Now, I think you know that moment. And I want to tell you how I handled it, how I handled the moment. But I did it in terms of environment, okay? Because I think everything's connected. In that moment that I'm talking about is connected with so many other phenomena, okay? And what I did in this particular passage is to imagine, to express that moment, because I couldn't mention all your names. I'd be very careful. Okay? So I created names for those two. One is a man called Kamete, some of the woods, and the one is Nyawera, a working person, a lady, a woman. And they are walking together in the forest. And I try to create that moment really in terms of environment, very much because environment is part also of who we are, we think of environment so much in terms of external, things, the tree, the air, as if they are external. But when you come to think of it, they are not actually, yes, they are external, but they are so central to my existence because today, but don't do it, but if you cut off my arm, for instance, and I can live safe for many years to come, okay? But if you switched off the air, I will not exist. After a few seconds, I'm no more, So if I think of water and food, there's a way in which although it's external to me, but in other sense, it's more central to me, it's more me than even one of my limbs, okay? In that sense, so it's both external and very part of my internal being at the same time, So I try to explain that moment in terms of environment. And what happens is one paragraph, and they are walking together, and they find that they were like-minded about so many things. They often punctuated their talk with songs, stories, and friendly banters, such as when they came across a zebra rat and then a field mouse, and they sang a song about it. It was a song that helped them count up to 10, but the logic was in the rhythm instead of the meaning of the words. Once again, they laughed together. And then, as they looked in each other's eyes, they were suddenly without words. They resumed their walk in silence, taken up by the light they saw in each other's eyes. Love was everywhere. It was there in the tree branches where the nests of weaver birds hung. It was there in the fern where the widow bird had left 2 long black tail feathers. It was there in the murmurings of the Elders River as it flowed eastward before turning into a roaring waterfall. It was there in the sun's rays which pierced through the waterfall, splitting into the 7 colors of the rainbow. It was there in the still waters of a small lake made by the river, where Kamete and Nyawera now swam and bathed and chased each other, splashing water on each other. It was there in the blackjacks, the goosegrass and other plants, the flowers and seeds of which stuck to their wet clothes. It was there in the movement of porcupines and hedgehogs. It was there in the wings of the helmeted and crested guinea fowls that scampered away after stealing glances at the couple. It was there in the honeybees and butterflies hopping from flower to flower. It was there in the cooing of the doves. It was there in the mating calls of the river frogs from among the reeds and water lilies. Love was there among the creeping plants that twined around the tree trunks. Yes, it was there in the blackberries, some of which they plucked and fed to each other. Love was there in the breeze that made the leaves sway ever so gently. Love was everywhere in this forest, but neither Nyawera nor committee mentioned the word. That's your moment. Don't say anything about it.
We're kind of past time. We're going to have a reception, so you're certainly welcome to come by and ask your questions in a more intimate manner. So I just want to thank you all for coming and thank Ngugi very much.
Yeah, thank you.